The dust on Kepris-7 had a peculiar quality that Adrian Walsh couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't the fine talc of Mars or the sticky regolith of Luna. This stuff moved like liquid smoke, flowing around his boots in spirals that seemed almost deliberate. He'd been walking for 3 hours through the canyon approach, and the dust had followed him like a curious pet. If he were the poetic type, which his ex-wife would confirm he absolutely wasn't, he might have called it beautiful. Instead, he just wished it would stop getting into his scanner's intake valves. The ruins appeared gradually, the way massive things do when you're approaching on foot. First, just irregular shadows against the rust-colored cliffs. Then geometric impossibilities that made his engineer's brain itch. Then the full structure, rising from the canyon floor like frozen music, all sweeping curves and angles that shouldn't support themselves but did. Had been doing so for at least 3,000 years, according to the university survey team who'd stumbled across this place 6 months ago. Walsh adjusted the strap on his equipment pack and tried not to think about the message from his lawyer that had arrived just before he'd left the orbital station. Divorce proceedings were apparently going smoothly, which felt like an oxymoron. How could the dissolution of 12 years be smooth? Then again, Sarah had always been efficient. It was one of the things he'd loved about her, back when love was still the operative emotion. He pushed the thought away and focused on what he was good at: structures, load-bearing calculations, the honest mathematics of stress and strain. The university wanted him to assess whether the ruins were stable enough for a full archaeological team. Simple job. 2 days of scans, maybe 3 if the internal structure was more complex than it appeared. Then back to the station, back to his empty apartment, back to the slow dissolution of everything he built that wasn't made of stone and steel. The entrance yawned before him, a perfect arch that seemed to have been carved by wind but showed no signs of erosion. Walsh ran his gloved hand along the edge, feeling the smooth surface through the feedback sensors in his suit. His heads-up display flickered with data, composition analysis, age estimates, structural integrity readings that made him frown. The material was denser than it should be, harder than any known alloy from this region. The survey team had noted that too, but they'd been focused on the artistic and historical implications. Walsh cared about whether the ceiling would stay up. He stepped inside, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in as many steps. His suit compensated automatically, but he felt the change as a whisper of chill against his skin. The silence was immediate and absolute. Not even the whistle of wind that had been his constant companion in the canyon. Just his breathing, steady and loud in his helmet, and the soft beep of his equipment cycling through its diagnostic routines. The main chamber stretched ahead, dim except for the pale light from his helmet lamp. Columns rose at intervals that bothered him until he realized they followed a mathematical progression, each one placed at a distance determined by the previous two. Fibonacci sequence in architecture. Whoever built this place understood that beauty and function were the same thing, approached from different angles. Walsh was setting up his primary scanner when the device chirped an alert. Subsurface anomaly detected. 40 meters down, almost directly beneath his position. A hollow space, roughly 30 cubic meters, where the preliminary ground-penetrating survey had shown only solid rock. He pulled up the survey data on his wrist display, comparing it to his scanner's current readings. The survey had been thorough, conducted by good equipment operated by people who knew what they were doing. So either his scanner was malfunctioning, unlikely, given that he'd calibrated it himself that morning, or something had changed in the 6 months since the survey. Or something had been deliberately hidden. The engineer in him set to market, noted in his report, let the archaeologists puzzle it out. They loved mysteries. Walsh preferred problems that could be solved with math and the occasional application of a welding torch. But the part of him that had driven Sarah crazy with his inability to leave well enough alone was already calculating the best approach vector, identifying the weakest point in the floor where he could descend without bringing the whole structure down on his head. Protocol said to report any significant deviations from the survey before proceeding. Protocol also required a functioning communication system, which Walsh had tested 3 times since entering the ruins without getting anything but static. The canyon walls were rich in some mineral that played havoc with radio signals. He'd known that coming in. The plan had been to do his surface work, then return to the canyon entrance to upload his findings. He looked at the readings again. 30 cubic meters. About the size of a small room. Could be a burial chamber. Could be a storage space. Could be absolutely nothing interesting. But it was there, where it shouldn't be, and Adrian Walsh had never been good at walking away from structural anomalies. He traced a path across the floor, tapping it with the sensor wand, building a three-dimensional map of the spaces below. The hollow area was deeper than he'd thought, and more regular in shape. Definitely artificial. The rock between his position and that space had been weakened by time and geological shifts, there, a natural fissure that ran almost straight down. With careful application of his micro-excavation tools, he could widen it enough to descend. This was stupid. This was exactly the kind of stupid that had led to him spending 3 days trapped in a collapsed mine shaft on Titan, surviving on recycled water and protein bars that tasted like cardboard's disappointing cousin. Sarah had met him at the hospital and asked, not for the first time, why he couldn't just assess structures from a safe distance like a sensible person. He missed her. The thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome, and he shoved it away by activating his excavation laser. The beam cut into the rock with a sound like tearing silk, and dust, that peculiar liquid dust, began to rise in lazy spirals around his boots. The descent took 2 hours, and Walsh spent most of it mentally composing the incident report he'd have to file if this turned out to be nothing. Engineer ignores safety protocols due to curiosity and mild existential crisis, probably wouldn't look great in his personnel file, but at least it would be honest. The fissure had widened more easily than expected, almost as if the rock wanted to let him through. Which was ridiculous. Rock didn't want anything. Rock just sat there being rock, following the simple rules of geology and time. His boots touched solid ground, and the fissure opened into a space larger than his scanner had suggested. Walsh swept his helmet light across the chamber, and his breath caught. Not from fear or wonder, but from the simple recognition that he'd found something nobody had seen in a very long time. The walls were covered in symbols that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision, staying still only when he looked directly at them. Crystalline formations grew from the ceiling like inverted trees, pulsing with a faint bioluminescence that his equipment couldn't quite explain. Then he heard it. Soft. Barely audible over his own breathing. A sound that didn't belong in a chamber sealed for centuries. Crying. Walsh froze, his engineering brain immediately running through rational explanations. Audio hallucination from oxygen recycler malfunction. Check. His suit systems showed green across the board. Acoustic phenomenon caused by air currents through the rock. Check. His atmospheric sensor detected no air movement whatsoever. Which left the irrational explanation, the one that made his skin prickle despite 15 years of dealing with the strange corners of the galaxy. Someone was down here. He moved toward the sound, his light cutting through the dimness, and found the collapse. Recent, geologically speaking, maybe a century old, maybe less. A wall of rubble that had once been an archway, and from beyond it, the crying continued. No, not just crying. Voices. Plural. Young voices speaking in a language that made his translator chip buzz with frustrated static. Walsh pulled his largest excavation tool from his pack, a device he'd modified himself to be more precise than the factory setting. He'd once told Sarah he treated his tools better than he treated people. She'd said she'd noticed. The memory stung, so he focused on the work, carefully removing stones, testing the stability of each piece before shifting it, aware that one wrong move could bring the ceiling down and turn this rescue attempt into a tomb for everyone involved. The gap widened. The voices grew louder, more urgent, and he caught fragments that his translator managed to parse. Light. Someone comes. The promised one. Walsh almost laughed. Promised one. Right. He was a guy with a knack for math and a tendency to make poor decisions when bored. The most prophetic thing about him was his ability to predict which takeout restaurants would give him indigestion. He pulled away a final stone, and light spilled through the gap. Not his light. A soft, golden glow from within the chamber beyond. Walsh widened the opening enough to squeeze through, and that's when he saw them. 5 girls, clustered together in the center of a circular room. They appeared human at first glance, 2 arms, 2 legs, faces arranged in the familiar pattern. But their ears swept upward and back, elegant and delicate, like something from ancient earth mythology that his mother used to read to him. Elves, she'd called them, though these girls were decidedly real and very much alive. They stared at him with expressions mixing terror and desperate hope in a way that made Walsh's chest tighten. The oldest looked maybe 15, her dark hair matted but her posture regal despite the dirt and obvious malnutrition. The youngest couldn't be more than 7, all enormous eyes and trembling lower lip. Between them, 3 others, a pair who had to be twins, mirror images of each other, and a girl with copper-colored hair who watched him with an intensity that felt like being measured for some purpose he didn't understand. The eldest stepped forward and dropped to her knees. The others followed instantly, their movements synchronized in a way that spoke of practice or instinct or both. "Shomara," the eldest said, her voice cracking with emotion. "You have come." Walsh's translator caught the word but flagged it as untranslatable, a proper noun, a title, a concept without direct human equivalent. He held up his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of non-threatening confusion. "Okay, let's start with something simpler," he said, knowing his translator would render his words into something they could understand. "I'm Adrian. I'm an engineer. I was supposed to be checking if the building upstairs was going to fall down, which now seems like the least of our problems. Who are you, and how long have you been down here?" The eldest lifted her head, confusion flickering across her features. "You are the Shomara. The promised one who comes when the light begins to fade. It is written in the stones of knowing." Walsh glanced around the chamber, taking in details his initial shock had made him miss. Sleeping pallets arranged in a neat circle. Storage containers made of that same impossible material as the ruins above. A device in the corner that pulsed with slowly dimming light, some kind of power source or life support system, clearly failing. His engineering assessment was immediate and grim. Whatever had kept these kids alive was running on fumes. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice gentle, "I think there's been a mistake. I'm not a promised anything. I'm just a guy who's really good at math and really bad at following safety guidelines. My ex-wife would be happy to provide references on both counts." The twins exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. One of them, he couldn't tell which, spoke up. "You came through the Eastern Passage." "In the time of 3 shadows," the other finished. "Wearing the metal skin of the Star Walkers," the first continued. "Bearing the mark of divided worlds," said the second, pointing at his left hand. Walsh looked down at his wedding ring, still on his finger 3 months after Sarah had removed hers. The mark of divided worlds. That was either the most depressing thing he'd ever heard or accidentally profound. Possibly both. Walsh sat cross-legged on the chamber floor, his environment suit's joints creaking in protest, while 5 pairs of eyes watched his every movement like he might spontaneously produce a miracle. He distributed his emergency ration bars, which the girls had accepted with a reverence usually reserved for religious artifacts, and was now trying to explain the concept of wrong place, wrong time, definitely the wrong guy, to an audience who seemed determined to misunderstand him. "The Eastern Passage bit," he said, pulling up a holographic map from his wrist display, "that's just because the western entrance was blocked by a rockslide. See? Basic geology, not destiny." Lyrie, the eldest, had finally offered her name after Walsh had asked 3 times, shook her head with patient certainty. "The prophecy states clearly, he will come from the direction of the rising sun, when all other paths are sealed." "The rising sun on a moon that's tidally locked to its planet," Walsh muttered. "So basically any direction is the rising sun depending on where you're standing." He caught himself and added, No offense to your prophecy. I'm sure it's very well written. Great imagery. Really evocative stuff. The copper-haired girl, Nika, who'd barely spoken, made a sound that might have been a laugh. The twins, Sarah and Mira, smiled identical smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. Little Vess, the youngest, had attached herself to Walsh's leg and showed no signs of letting go. Walsh tried a different approach. Let me show you what I actually am. He activated his scanner and projected the structural analysis of the chamber above them. See these stress points? The way the weight distributes through the columns? That's what I do. I look at buildings and figure out if they're going to kill people. It's a living, and occasionally it pays for decent coffee, but it's not exactly savior material. You understand the bones of the world, Lyrie said, studying the hologram with interest. The ancient texts speak of this knowledge. The Shulmara will read the language of stone and metal, will see the invisible forces that bind and break. That's literally just physics, Walsh protested, but he was losing ground and knew it. Every mundane detail of his existence was apparently prophetic gold to these kids. His helmet. The metal skin. His multi-tool. The instrument of 7 purposes. His chronic lower back pain from years of crawling through tight spaces. Probably proof of some cosmic burden or another. He changed tactics again, focusing on practical concerns. How long have you been down here? Lyrie's expression flickered, the first crack in her composed facade. The Guardians sealed us when the lights first came. They said they would return when it was safe. We have counted 4,312 sleep cycles since then. Walsh did the math automatically. Roughly 12 years, assuming they slept once per standard day. 12 years in this chamber. He looked at Vess, still clinging to his leg. She'd been practically a baby when they'd been sealed in. His throat tightened. Your guardians, he said carefully. They left you supplies. That life support system in the corner. The heart of endurance, Mira said. It was supposed to last forever, Sarah added. But forever is shorter than we were told. They finished together, a habit Walsh found both endearing and slightly unsettling. He scanned the device they'd indicated, and his equipment spat out readings that made him wince. The technology was beyond anything he'd seen, some kind of zero-point energy converter coupled with an atmospheric recycler that should have been impossible. But impossible or not, it was failing. The power cells were degrading, probably had been for years. He gave it another week, maybe 2, before it stopped functioning entirely. Okay, Walsh said, forcing his voice to stay level. New plan. We need to get you out of here. My ship is 3 kilometers from the canyon entrance. We get to the surface, get you all to the ship, and then we figure out the rest. Food, medical attention, finding out what happened to your people. We cannot leave, Lyrie said, and there was genuine fear in her voice now. The Guardians sealed us for a reason. The enemy may still hunt us. The enemy, Walsh repeated. What enemy? But Lyrie shook her head, and for the first time, she looked her age, a frightened teenager carrying responsibilities that should never have been hers. We don't know. They never told us. Only that we must stay hidden until the Shulmara comes to lead us into the light. Walsh resisted the urge to point out that he'd literally brought light with him in the form of his helmet lamp, which they'd probably cite as further proof. Instead, he pulled up his communication logs, showing them screen after screen of static. I can't call for help from down here. The canyon walls block the signal. We have to move, prophecy or not, because that life support system is going to fail, and when it does. He let the sentence hang, hoping they understood without him having to paint the picture. Nika spoke then, her voice soft but clear. We know. We've known for 30 sleep cycles. The heart grows quieter each day. We can feel it. Feel it? Walsh's engineer brain perked up. You can sense the energy output. She nodded. The vibrations. They've been slowing. Like a pulse that weakens. Walsh looked at the girl with new interest. Vibrational sensitivity wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of in some species. It was a trait that mining companies paid good money for, people who could sense instabilities in rock formations before they became catastrophic. He filed that information away and focused on the immediate problem. Right, he said. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to stabilize that device as much as I can, buy us some time. Then we're going to plan a route to the surface that won't get us killed. I'm going to need your help, because you know this place and I don't. Deal? The girls looked at each other, that silent communication passing between them again. Walsh wondered if it was cultural or something else, some ability his species lacked. Finally, Lyrie nodded. We will help the Shomara complete his task. Just Adrian is fine, Walsh said, but he was already unpacking his tools. The Shomara thing makes me sound like I should be wearing a cape, and I don't have the shoulders for it. Vess giggled, a sound like bells, and Walsh decided that if he could make a kid who'd been trapped underground for 12 years laugh, maybe he wasn't completely useless after all. Even if he wasn't anybody's savior. The heart of endurance, as Walsh had started calling it in his head because the impossible device that defies thermodynamics was too much of a mouthful, sat open before him like a puzzle designed by someone who'd never heard of user-friendly engineering. He'd been staring at its internals for 20 minutes, and his understanding had progressed from completely baffled to slightly less completely baffled. So this crystal matrix here, he said, pointing with his microprobe, it's channeling energy from where exactly? Lyrie knelt beside him, studying the device with the same intensity he usually reserved for load-bearing calculations. The fabric between spaces. The Guardians called it the hollow current. Right. The fabric between spaces. Of course. Walsh made a note on his datapad, ask physicists if zero-point energy extraction is actually possible or if I'm having a breakdown. He poked at another component, a spiral of metal that hummed when his probe came near. And this part? That is the Song Keeper, Sarah said from his other side. It maintains the rhythm of the air, Mira added. Walsh glanced between them. You two finish each other's sentences a lot. Is that a twin thing or a raised in isolation for 12 years thing? Both, they said simultaneously, then grinned at each other. Fantastic. Very helpful. But Walsh found himself smiling despite the situation. There was something endearing about their synchronization, like watching a well-rehearsed performance. He turned his attention back to the device, tracing the energy flow patterns with his scanner. The readings made no sense by conventional physics, but the patterns were there, elegant, mathematical, precise. Someone had built this thing using principles he didn't understand but could maybe, possibly, work with. Okay, he said, mostly to himself. The crystal matrix is degrading because... He paused, noting the microfractures spreading through the lattice structure. Because it's been running continuously for 12 years without maintenance, and crystalline structures fatigue just like everything else. The Song Keeper is compensating by drawing more power, which accelerates the degradation, which creates a feedback loop that... He trailed off, doing calculations in his head. Yeah, we've got maybe 10 days, not 2 weeks. Can you repair it? Lyrie asked, and Walsh heard the weight behind the question. How many nights had these girls gone to sleep wondering if the heart would still be beating when they woke? I can't repair it, he admitted. I don't understand the underlying technology well enough. But I can maybe stabilize it, reduce the load, squeeze out a few more days. He pulled out a compact toolkit that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. I'm going to need complete silence and possibly a minor miracle. The silence I can enforce. The miracle I'll have to improvise. Vess tugged on his sleeve. She hadn't let go of him for more than a few minutes since he'd arrived, treating him like a security blanket that happened to be able to operate power tools. Will it hurt the heart? Walsh looked down at her, at those enormous eyes filled with concern for a machine that had kept her alive. No, he said gently. I'm going to make it comfortable. Give it a chance to rest a little. She seemed satisfied with that answer and settled beside him, watching his every move with rapt attention. Walsh worked slowly, carefully, bypassing degraded circuits and rerouting power flow to avoid the worst of the damaged sections. It was like performing surgery with a wrench, delicate and brutal at the same time. His hands, usually steady, trembled slightly from the awareness that 5 lives depended on him not screwing this up. Nika appeared at his shoulder, silent as always. "The vibrations are changing," she said softly. "Smoother. Less erratic." Walsh checked his scanner, and she was right. The power fluctuations were evening out. "You can really feel that? The energy patterns?" She nodded. "Always. The walls speak too. They tell me when stress builds, when stone wants to shift. That's..." Walsh paused, his mind racing. "That's incredibly useful. Like, could save all our lives getting out of here, useful." He filed away another mental note: Nika has structural precognition superpowers, don't ignore her. An hour passed, then 2. Walsh's back screamed in protest from the awkward position, but he ignored it. The device was responding to his modifications, its pulsing light steadying to a more regular rhythm. Not perfect, but better. He closed the access panel and sat back, wiping sweat from his forehead. "That should buy us time," he said. "Now we need to talk about getting out of here." He pulled up the 3-dimensional scan he'd made of the structure above them. The main route, back through the fissure he'd descended, was obvious but problematic. The passage was narrow, unstable, and would require the girls to climb nearly 40 meters with minimal handholds. Doable for him in his suit with its strength assist servos. Potentially fatal for malnourished kids who'd spent 12 years in a chamber barely large enough to run in circles. "There has to be another way," he muttered, rotating the hologram, studying the network of spaces and voids that honeycombed the structure. The ruins were more complex than the initial surveys had suggested, layers of chambers and corridors that didn't follow any architectural logic he recognized. "The water road," Lyrie said suddenly, pointing to a section of the map that Walsh had dismissed as solid rock. "There. The Guardian spoke of it. A path that follows the ancient rivers beneath the stone." Walsh enhanced that section, pushing his scanner to its limits. There, faint traces of a void space, too regular to be natural. A tunnel, perhaps, carved by water or intention. It ran roughly parallel to the surface before angling upward. If it was still intact, if it wasn't flooded or collapsed, if a dozen other variables went in their favor, it might lead them out without the climbing risk. "The water road hasn't been used in generations," Lyrie continued. "The Guardians said it was dangerous. And staying here isn't." Walsh pulled up seismic data from his initial survey. The fault line he'd noted earlier ran close to their current position, too close. The entire structure was under stress, and his excavation to reach the girls had probably made it worse. "This whole place is slowly sinking. I give it 3 days, maybe 4, before we get a major shift. When that happens, this chamber could collapse, the heart could fail from the impact, or both. So dangerous tunnel versus certain death by roof collapse. I know which one I'm picking." Sarah and Mira had been whispering to each other, their heads close together. Now they looked up, identical expressions of determination on their faces. "We found water once," Sarah said. "During our 3rd year here," Mira continued. "A trickle through the wall. We followed it to a crack too small to fit through. But we heard space beyond. Echoes." Walsh felt a spark of hope. "Show me where." The crack was exactly where the twins had described, hidden behind a storage container they'd pushed aside with surprising efficiency. Walsh scanned it, and his equipment confirmed what his eyes suspected. The gap continued deep into the rock, widening after about 2 meters into something that might, generously, be called a tunnel. Getting to that wider section would require expanding the opening, which meant controlled demolition in a structurally unstable ruin while trying not to crush 5 kids and himself. "This is a terrible idea," Walsh announced cheerfully. "Which means it's probably going to work, because that's how my life operates." He set up his excavation laser on its lowest setting, configuring it for precision rather than speed. Nika stood beside him, one hand pressed flat against the wall, her eyes closed in concentration. Walsh had learned to trust her instincts over the past hours. She'd warned him twice about stress points before his scanner had caught them. "The stone is afraid," she said softly. "Join the club," Walsh muttered, then caught himself. "Wait, what does that mean practically?" "It wants to move." "Not now, but soon. We should hurry." Walsh increased the laser's power slightly and began cutting. The beam sliced through rock that had stood for millennia, each fragment falling away to reveal more of the passage beyond. Dust filled the air despite the chamber's recycling system, and he was grateful for his helmet's filtration. The girls had wrapped cloth around their faces, looking like miniature bandits preparing for a heist. The opening widened enough for Walsh to squeeze through, and he did, his suit scraping against stone on both sides. Beyond, the tunnel stretched into darkness, sloping upward at an angle that made his engineer's heart sing. Natural water erosion, modified by deliberate carving, he could see tool marks on the walls, precise and intentional. Someone had turned a geological accident into a functional passage. "It's clear," he called back. "We can do this." Getting everyone through took careful coordination. Walsh went first, then talked Vess through, catching her as she tumbled out of the gap. Then the twins, moving with that eerie synchronization. Nika slipped through like she'd done it 100 times. Lyrie came last, pausing at the threshold to look back at the chamber that had been her entire world for 12 years. "We'll come back someday," Walsh said, surprising himself with the promise. "When it's safe. When we understand what happened. You can show archaeologists where you lived, tell them about the Guardians, about the heart. Your story matters." Lyrie nodded, blinking rapidly, and climbed through. The tunnel rose steadily, and Walsh led the way with his helmet light cutting through absolute darkness. His scanner painted the route ahead, flagging obstacles and weak points. Twice they had to crawl through sections where the ceiling had partially collapsed. Once, Nika stopped them just before Walsh would have stepped on a section of floor she insisted was sleeping wrong. His subsequent scan revealed a void beneath that would have swallowed him whole. "You're never allowed to leave my side," Walsh told her. "I'm claiming you as my official structural consultant. The pay is terrible but the job security is excellent." She actually smiled at that, a quick flash that transformed her serious face into something lighter. They'd been climbing for 3 hours when Walsh's communication system crackled to life. He stopped so abruptly that Sarah walked into his back. "Say that again," he said into his helmet mic, not daring to believe it. "Kepris Orbital Station repeating. We received your distress beacon 7 hours ago. Rescue craft is in descent pattern. What is your current location?" Walsh looked at his wrist display. The beacon he'd activated before descending into the ruins, the one he'd assumed was useless in the canyon's interference, had somehow gotten through. Or maybe the station had finally sent a relay drone close enough to pick up the signal. Either way, salvation was incoming. 1 human, 5 Kelthari juveniles, approximately 1 kilometer from the eastern canyon rim, Walsh reported, his voice catching slightly. "We're mobile but need immediate medical assessment and supplies." "Copy that. ETA 23 minutes. Transmitting landing coordinates now." The girls had gathered around him, not understanding the words but reading the change in his expression. "Help is coming," Walsh told them. "Real help. Ships, doctors, people who actually know what they're doing." "But you are the Shomara," Vess said, confused. "You know everything." Walsh laughed, the sound echoing in the tunnel. "I know how to keep buildings from falling down and how to make terrible coffee. Everything else I'm improvising." He looked at each of them in turn, Lyrie with her careful dignity, The twins with their shared soul, Nika with her gift for reading the world's bones, little Vess who decided he was worth trusting. But you 5? You survived 12 years in a hole in the ground with a machine that was dying and no guarantee anyone would ever find you. That's not prophecy. That's strength. They emerged from the tunnel into slanting afternoon light that made the girls shield their eyes. Walsh's suit automatically dimmed his visor, but he saw their wonder as they stepped onto Kepler-7's surface for the first time in their memory. The dust swirled around them in greeting, and overhead, the planet they orbited hung massive and blue-green in the sky. The rescue ship appeared as a speck that grew into a roaring presence, its landing thrusters kicking up plumes of that peculiar liquid dust. Walsh positioned himself between the girls and the craft, old instincts kicking in. The airlock opened, and medical personnel emerged with equipment and concerned efficiency. The next hours blurred together. Examinations, questions, statements recorded for official records. The girls stayed close to Walsh throughout, and he found himself answering for them, explaining what he'd found, carefully omitting the parts about ignoring safety protocols and descending into unstable ruins without backup. The medical team's preliminary assessment was cautiously optimistic: malnourished but stable, psychologically resilient despite their isolation, no immediate life-threatening conditions. Walsh sat in the ship's common area while the girls slept in the medical bay, their first real rest in who knew how long. The captain, a woman named Torres with kind eyes and 3 decades of rescue operations under her belt, brought him coffee that actually tasted like coffee. "Galactic Services is already processing the paperwork," she said. 5 orphaned minors, species classified as protected under the Sentient Rights Act. They'll need guardians, cultural education, medical monitoring. She paused. "They keep asking for you." Walsh stared into his coffee. "I'm not guardian material. I can barely take care of myself. My ex-wife would testify to that." "Your ex-wife isn't here. You are." Torres sat across from him. "I've seen a lot of rescues, Walsh. Most people do the minimum, extract and evacuate. You went into an unstable ruin, stabilized failing life support with equipment you'd never seen before, and led 5 traumatized kids through a collapsing tunnel system. That's not minimum. That's someone who gives a damn." "They think I'm some kind of prophesied savior," Walsh said quietly. "I'm just an engineer who made a series of questionable decisions." "Maybe their prophecy was just a story to give them hope," Torres suggested. "Or maybe it was real, and prophecies work differently than we think. Maybe it's not about being chosen. Maybe it's about choosing to show up." Walsh thought about that, about the choices that had led him here, the failed marriage, the isolated assignment, the curiosity that had pulled him into the depths, the moment-by-moment decisions to keep going when turning back would have been easier. He thought about Lyrie's dignity and Nika's quiet wisdom and the way Vess had decided he was trustworthy based on nothing but faith. "I want to file for temporary guardianship," he heard himself say. "Until we find their people or figure out what happened. They shouldn't go into the system. They've been through enough." Torres smiled. "I thought you might say that. The paperwork's already started." 3 days later, Walsh stood in the orbital station's observation deck with 5 girls who were learning that the universe was much larger than a chamber beneath the ground. Vess pressed her face against the transparent aluminum, watching ships come and go. The twins argued cheerfully about which vessel looked fastest. Nika stood quietly beside Walsh, and he knew she was feeling the vibrations of the station, learning its rhythms. Lyrie watched it all with eyes that had seen too much but were learning to hope again. "What happens now?" she asked Walsh. He looked at his reflection in the window, saw a man who'd spent months running from his failures and found something worth running toward instead. "Now we figure it out together," he said. "I'll teach you about human bureaucracy, which is more terrifying than any prophecy. You'll teach me about your people. We'll find out what happened to the Guardians. We'll make sure no one forgets your story." "And the prophecy?" Lyrie asked. "Do you believe now that you are the Shulmara?" Walsh considered the question seriously. I believe I'm Adrian Walsh, engineer, recently divorced, terrible at following rules, pretty good at not letting buildings fall down. I believe I found 5 incredible kids who deserved better than being forgotten in the dark. And I believe that sometimes the universe puts you exactly where you need to be, even if you take the long way around. He looked at her. Is that enough? Lyrie smiled, really smiled, for the first time since he'd met her.